Just what are the principles behind data privacy and why are they principles and not rules? Well, we're going to be exploring that further in this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. Hello there and welcome to this week's episode of the Data Radio Show. I'm your host Paul, and this week we're exploring the principles behind data privacy. What it is that we should be looking at as guidelines for how we use the private data that we get as people working in the field. But before we jump into that, make sure that you hit that like, share and subscribe button so that you can get updates constantly of all the things that we're doing all the time. There's quite a bit, it's quite extensive. Anyway, this week I'm going to be sitting down and chatting to Richard Harris from Data Design Consulting. He works a lot with large organisations across Australia to help them with their data privacy needs, because as technology changes or the rules change or the way that we expect data to work changes, these things need to evolve. But the principles, well, are kind of the guiding light into how to deal with all of this. But Richard is a far better expert than I am on all of this. It's one of the reasons why he's helped us put together a classroom over on School for data privacy around those 9 principles, which you can do absolutely free by becoming a member of the School community. It's all linked down below if you're not already over there. In the meantime, let's check out this interview with Richard. He'll give us a bit of a rundown as to what's going on, and well, hopefully you get something interesting out of it that's going to help you out with either what you're doing or with the organizations that you work with. In the fast-evolving world of data management, professionals need more than just tools. They need a collaborative hub to learn, innovate, and lead. Enter the Data Innovators Exchange, a dynamic school-based community uniting data engineers, architects, and analysts to master cutting-edge practices like Data Vault 2.0 and navigate the AI-driven landscape. Access courses like the 9 Principles of Data Privacy and hands-on Data Vault tutorials, including real-world examples like Willowbold Data Vault Warehouse built with Data Vault for DBT. Participate in events like Warescape Expert Sessions and global summits in Brussels or Prague, blending online forums with in-person networking. Stay ahead with weekly updates on trends like China's cost-effective DeepSeek R1 LLM shaking up AI markets. Earn leaderboard rankings and win prizes like $50 Google Play vouchers for contributing to discussions or subscribing to their Data Radio Show podcast. Troubleshoot challenges with peers like optimizing CDC or change data capture workflows for Data Vault implementation. Members gain actionable skills, whether migrating to cloud platforms like Snowflake, automating ETL with Iris, or achieving GDPR compliance. The community's partnership with Scale-Free and Ignition Data ensures access to certified Data Vault training and mentorship. From interactive Q&As to curated resources on DBT and metadata governance, the Data Innovators Exchange is more than a forum. It's a launchpad for career advancement. Join 350 plus professional transforming data chaos into clarity. Ready to elevate your data engineering game? Visit Data Innovators Community by following the link below today and plug into the future of data management. Joining me now, Richard Harris from Data Design Consulting. How are you going today, Richard? How are things in Australia at the moment?
Very warm, very dry, but all in all, very good. Thank you, Paul. How are you?
I'm great. I heard a rumour that there was 40-degree heats over there recently. Were you in that area where it hit?
Absolutely, but then again, you have days where you're still wearing tracksuit pants and hoodies, so it's very difficult to call at the moment. But yeah, there's been quite a lot of heat recently. Yeah,
I was actually talking to someone who was in, I think it was Melbourne, and he made the mistake of going and buying an ice cream to cool himself down in the 40-degree heat and then going for a walk outside and didn't get to the end of the street before it was just a puddle of cream in his hand.
Yeah, I can sympathise. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, don't enjoy it at all. I've brought you on board because I wanted to talk data privacy, and we've just put up in our classroom a data privacy classroom for people to go and have a look at, which you've been involved in. It's your face on the screen for it all, because that's what you do. There's some really interesting stuff in there that I came across while I was editing it, and I really love the principles behind data privacy. I'm kind of curious if you could explain why you decided to go with principles instead of sort of hard and fast rules.
Sure. Well, mainly because we're talking to a global audience. Data privacy, the protection of personal information, is really a global issue. And when you look at the major legislations around the world that seek to protect how personal information is collected, stored, used, and disposed of, they all follow these general principles of data privacy. And so if you try and focus on the laws themselves, the regulations themselves, pretty soon you're down a rabbit hole of GDPR, CPRA, you name it, APPs. But they're all in their own way trying to do a similar thing, and they are all by and large principles based. The requirements that you see seek to put some guardrails and clarity over those principles, but you will find very rarely any of the regulations, dictatorial in how you must do things. They very much focus on what is expected. Then it comes down to understanding how the local regulators interpret some of those principles. So, for example, recently here in Australia, interesting guidance from the OAIC, our regulator, said that as far as they are concerned, that when you target someone, when someone comes to your website, you drop a tracking cookie or pixel in order to target them online with advertising, that is a form of direct marketing if you are using personal information as part of that transaction, and therefore you are obliged to provide an opt-out under the current Australian privacy principles. So it's a really good example that these laws are not static. Just because you understood how they were being applied a couple of years ago does not mean those ways that they are applied remains true today. So rather than, try and give everybody a mini law degree, I felt it was important to, if people understood these general principles, then regardless of where they were in the world, they at least had a good place to start with understanding, well, if I'm aware of these principles, if I'm applying them in a meaningful and ethical way, then probably I'm going to be compliant with the local regulations, obviously with some differences.
Yeah. One of the principles that you bring up, number 6, is on consent, which makes me wonder how something like a pixel or a cookie you have to agree to, but a pixel often gets embedded into a site and you might not necessarily know it. I know during our last general election, I think 4 of our 6 major parties used pixels on their websites to track what people were doing and what people were looking at, and it didn't come out until just before election day that people didn't realize that their data was being tracked that way. How does consent change in that way then with technology moving on? Like, do you have to warn people, you're coming onto this website, there's going to be a pixel here? And what can those organizations end up doing with that data that people might not be aware of?
Good question. It's a little difficult to answer for every jurisdiction because this is where we get into the world of slight differences. So I would caveat all of this by saying, look, for our audience here today, the data architects, the data scientists and so forth, understanding the mechanisms of how consent is obtained, I wouldn't worry too much about. There are others in the organization that bear the burden of ensuring that the way consent is obtained is in compliance with the regulations. What I'm encouraging this group to do is to understand that if you are looking to ingest a data set for a particular purpose, to ensure that you've asked the question, do we have a legal right to do so? And consent is one of those elements. So, for example, here in Australia, consent is actually not necessarily required when collecting personal information. Notification is. So letting people know that you're tracking them on your website and what kind of information you are collecting is one of those requirements. Whereas when you look at jurisdictions like GDPR, it goes beyond that. And the term consent, by the way, has a very particular meaning. It has to be explicit. It has to be specific. It has to be unambiguous, informed. So there are definitely like legal criteria that say if you are required to seek consent versus where there might be what we tend to call implied consent, where there might be a reasonable expectation of collecting information, which is where the notification comes in. So definitely there are differences in jurisdictions as to what this means. But for this group, I would say that your duty of care is to ensure that if a piece of data is to be used for a particular purpose, that you ask the question, do we have a legal right to do so? And make sure that's been captured somewhere in your documentation as you plan your projects.
With that explicitity that you're talking about, there are,
Mm.
if I'm upgrading my operating system here, for example, I get 20 pages of very, very fine print from the people that put out the operating system. I know Microsoft Office Suite have just done an upgrade on theirs, where part of the very, very buried in the deep end of their terms and conditions is that they can now scrape your work for artificial intelligence training. How explicit are we talking when it comes to explicitness? Is that another thing that's a regional difference or
There are
contextually based?
definitely regional differences in terms of the expectation, but what you're talking to there is one of the key principles, one in fact, of transparency. And transparency isn't just that you have to have told them. Transparency is you have to have told people in a way that is clear and unambiguous. And so one of the things that I often find when looking at privacy policies, for example, is people have gone to such lengths to write, pages and pages of very, very detailed policy information. But when you look at the average user, they're not going to read that. Or if they do, they're not necessarily going to understand it if it's quite densely written. And so that in itself could be not a breach necessarily, but certainly questionable when it comes to that principle of transparency. So again, it's one of those areas of, again, if you're using information for a particular purpose, just to make sure, well, have we informed people that, when we collect their information, let's say that someone signs up to a newsletter and we ask for a range of information, but then I want to go and use that information to go and train an artificial intelligence to do something. Is there a reasonable expectation? Again, I wouldn't expect this audience to know at that level of detail, but it's a good principle or good practice to at least ask the question of those people who have collected the information to say, well, have you collected it in such a way that I get to use it for the purpose for which we are putting it? And where is your legal justification? One of the last principles is that idea of accountability. Accountability is not just you do comply, is that you can demonstrate that compliance. And so there should be people in the organization that, should be able to very easily say, yes, here's our justification in why we can use this information. If they don't have that, that might raise a red flag as to say, well, we should probably look at our data collection processes. Specifically talking to the Office thing, I haven't read the documentation myself. My supposition, however, would be that it's probably limited to when you're using the Copilot plugin. So if you uploaded a document and asked it to interpret that document, then it will probably be saying, yeah, well, we get to use that process and what was in that document. I know that Grammarly have a similar condition inside their terms and conditions that once you use the Grammarly service, anything that goes on inside, they have a right to use. Again, they have a specific purpose. They can't just suck it up and do whatever they like. It helps them improve their algorithms and what they do. So again, when you are looking at artificial intelligence, particularly when you're allowing staff to use these large language models like Copilot, like ChatGPT, it's very important to have a policy developed that encourages them, to understand what large language models they are allowed to use, how they can use it, and more specifically, the things they should not be doing. So, for example, do not upload a document that's got a lot of PII of our clients in it to a Copilot model. Those are the kind of things that we now need to think about in a policy.
One of the other principles that you've got here is international transfers. And this one jumped out at me because I was actually having a chat to the CEO of one of our telco companies last week, where they've just signed a deal or just about to launch a technology sharing program with Starlink, Elon Musk's Starlink satellite thing, so that there's 100% coverage for cell phones all over the country. And one of the questions I asked him was, how do you go about ensuring that people who are here, trapped in the middle of nowhere, sending a text message via Starlink, the data is secure? And the response I got was, we highest international standards. We work to GDPR. We work really hard on this. For you, what does Principle 8 actually mean? What does international transfers play into? How does that work, and why is that important?
Yeah. Let's remember that when this principle was first relevant, we're going back predating the internet just about.
Mm-hmm.
There was a time when we were using a lot more direct mail for our marketing purposes. Now, in that paradigm, organizations might build their creative and build their mailing list, but that data might be sent overseas for an overseas entity to do the printing, to package everything up in some way. And under that paradigm, it was very important to have some guidelines over how that entity behaves with that information. We now live in a world where really information can be almost anywhere because of cloud storage and the like, which is, as I mentioned before, why we need to keep up to date on the way that the regulators are interpreting the law and look at their guidelines, not simply looking at the law. So, for example, here in Australia, in the most recent update to our Privacy Act, within that there will be a process into which the minister will be able to create a list of prescribed countries that our government can point to and say, well, those organizations, entities that work within the jurisdiction of that law, for the UK, for example, France, the US, operate under a similar structure than we do in Australia. So they offer the similar protections. And so that greatly reduces the obligation on entities here in Australia to do any kind of due diligence other than making sure that their contracts say we comply with our privacy laws. Those countries that fall outside of the prescribed list, yes, there is still a requirement to do some of that due diligence and seek some additional protections. But this comes back to the accountability principle, of course. At the end of the day, you are responsible for the personal information. You've collected my information. I've read your policy, and your policy is what tells me how you treat my personal information. If a third party that you choose to use misuses my information, ultimately you are accountable for that. It's not good enough to say it's not us, it was our service provider. There is an onus. So that idea of being able to demonstrate that accountability also becomes that important in the way that you construct your relationships, your contractual agreements, and so forth with those external vendors. If you look at the data breaches that we've seen a lot of, quite often there's a third-party entity. And early in the days of the internet, there were some organizations that did indeed try and say, oh, it wasn't us, it was our service provider. And that didn't fly then, and it really doesn't fly now. So again, it's that, yes, use service providers, of course, but make sure that you do have to monitor them and make sure they do what they say they're doing and protecting that information.
With the potential, there's always potential of something going wrong. Is that where data minimization comes in? So that you're not having excess data that could be at risk?
Yeah. It seems to be one of the universal problems that I certainly see. That people have this hoarder mentality of, well, we might need that information, we should keep it. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that if that information is being archived properly. So if it's being hived off and sits behind a DMZ or a firewall that can't be touched through normal systems, if it's, if there's a legitimate need to keep it, sure. But there is a wealth of problems of people, for example, exporting data from a CRM, for example, so they can do some basic data manipulation and reporting in Excel. Okay, but then what are they doing with that Excel file? And if that Excel file has personal information in it and it's sitting on someone's hard drive and they just keep saving new versions, etc., over time, they're retaining information long past the time that it was necessary, and that's going to put them in breach. So you're absolutely right. A big part of data security, information security, is realizing we should be minimizing the amount of information we hold to only the information that is absolutely necessary. So again, for this audience, I would also put something on the table which says, if you are building, for example, a data warehouse to support your single source of truth, it might be part of your master data management and so forth, be very, very clear about how you're architecting. This is one of the benefits of Data Vault, of course, that idea of being able to keep personal information in different satellites that can be applied with a lot greater level of securities and protections, but also asking the question, do I really need personal identity information within my data warehouse to begin with? There are lots of questions from a data minimization standpoint that says, well, for this purpose, if I'm training this AI, for example, do I need the AI to have access to personal information, or do I only give it the aggregate view of information or the behaviors that don't allow it to identify an individual, which also, of course, goes to the principle of access.
Having that minimization in place as well, I'm guessing, goes very clearly hand in hand with integrity and accuracy, which is another one of the principles in there, that you've got to have that accuracy so you know exactly what it is that you need to get, so you don't have too much data. You're not oversupplying yourself essentially with anything that's superfluous.
And also, if we're talking AI as well, having a high level of data quality, and quality can be defined in a number of ways, obviously, accuracy, completeness, timeliness, and so forth. But making sure that information is of enough quality to support what you're trying to do with artificial intelligence is kind of vital. From an ethical standpoint, we know that human bias can be found within the data sets that we produce. And we need to control for that. We need to make sure that we understand that. If data is inaccurate, if it has errors within it, then we run the very real risk of having the AI produce inaccurate results. And that's kind of what we're seeing as being the big trend. A lot of organizations have kind of said, yep, AI is here. We need to use it. We've already talked about the large language models that the staff can use from their browser. But once you start looking at artificial intelligence internally, the big stumbling point for most organizations is their data governance. Is, well, we need to know, where did this information came from? Do we have the right consent and permissions to use this information? Is it to the right level of accuracy? There's a lot of things that organizations now are realizing that they really don't have in place in order to be able to deploy artificial intelligence as they would like to use it. And I think over the next few years, we are going to see data governance initiatives being driven by the need to deploy artificial intelligence. That's going to be the next, big business case, I think.
Did I read somewhere that this week the Australian government's banned DeepSeek?
I've been following the DeepSeek thing. I don't believe the Australian government have banned it. There is a regulation and guidelines about how government agencies can use artificial intelligence. So I can't really confirm that. I've been a little distracted on a client project this week. But I have noticed, though, that there are countries that have raised concerns over DeepSeek. Whether this is because it relates to the TikTok issue and it's a Chinese organization, I don't know. Partly, I suspect that there's concerns being raised because, as I understand the power of DeepSeek, it's not the algorithm itself that's necessarily better than any of the others. It's the efficiency of the algorithm that greatly reduces the footprint on these very expensive CPUs that need to do all the data processing. So it's that I understand represents the bigger threat, if you like, because chip makers like Nvidia have massive amounts of their share price wiped out overnight because
Hmm.
all of a sudden it's conceivable that we can run these models much cheaper using a different approach. So I think there's going to be a lot to unpick from the issues people have with DeepSeek.
We actually ran a bit of an experiment with it for last week's episode, where we got it to write up a couple of promo scripts for us for some of our sponsors, and I found it really fascinating in that it was almost copy paste with the actual content. You knew what the beats were going to be, where this word was going to be. Enter this sponsor, and it was a really strange way of seeing content created that was very much cut and paste, but still felt to me very much like it was written by an AI. But the information that
Yeah.
it's used has been fed into it specifically from our sponsors, from people who have helped set up the stuff that we work with. So I found that part really fascinating, but I can't say I saw any difference in speed personally. So.
No, and I don't think it's necessarily speed. It's the efficiency of the processing that is just the underlying cost of running these. So I'd imagine we're going to see organizations that want to use DeepSeek as the underlying model and then build their own AIs on the top of it that they might want to commercialize that do specific functions. But as I say, AI is one of those areas where it's such a fast-paced
Yeah.
sector. It's kind of difficult to keep fully abreast, which is again why I bring it back down to focusing on these principles. Let us not forget that even in the world of AI, those principles still apply. That we need to be transparent about that we are using artificial intelligence, that the purpose limitation, that when we're collecting that information, if we're collecting it for training of the AI, that we're only collecting the minimum amount of information. Security, that an AI is just another agent, another entity. So making sure it can only access the information it is authorized to do so. So you can take all of those principles and apply them just as much to artificial intelligence as we could 20 or 30 years ago to direct mail.
Fantastic. One last question for you before we wrap up. What is an individual like myself going to get out of doing this course?
Well, I think it's first and foremost, it's kind of the right thing to do. We need a culture of data privacy compliance. The reality is that for most organizations, you can certainly appoint a data owner and a data steward who own some of the responsibility. But there's so much information being collected, being moved around and used that ideally we need everybody to at least have a working knowledge of some of the risks that come from using personal information. And then, kind of related to that, it's almost that last line of defense is making sure that if you are one of those people that feel very strongly that there should be an ethical use of information, well, these are the principles that if you apply them, if you feel that you're not following these, then you're butting up against perhaps what you're doing is unethical. And let's not forget, for most people, that's a very personal thing, and most people do want to do the right thing and not misuse people's personal information. And not to mention, of course, that from a skill standpoint, from the ability, to keep developing yourself and the value you bring to an organization, it never hurts to be able to say, look, I understand how to define personal information, how to identify it, and I understand the principles that need to be applied to manage that information ethically. Again, a lot of organizations, that's a skills gap that they're very keen to fill. So, look, this isn't necessarily going to make you a privacy expert and someone who can step into a data privacy officer role, but in your day-to-day lives, understanding what you need to be thinking about when you're dealing with personal information is, I think, almost as valuable as understanding how to capture the right metadata or build an enterprise data model. It's just one of those arrows in your quiver that can't help but be of value.
Fantastic. Richard, thank you so much for joining me today. People can actually find
No
that
worries,
course in
Paul.
my
Thank
path
you very
now.
much.
Have you had a chance to go through what we've set up yet? So you can tell me off if I've buggered it up?
No, I've been up to my eyeballs.
I know that feeling well. Until next time, Richard, thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Bye-bye.
Hey, again, thanks very much for checking out this interview, and I want to thank Richard for sitting down and having a chat with me this week about data privacy principles. It's a really fascinating topic because in my head, I keep thinking rules, but they're not rules, they're guiding principles, and there is a big difference there. It's been very, very informative. Hey, make sure that you hit that like button or share the video or podcast or subscribe to the channel so you can get constant updates from us. We've got a whole bunch of stuff coming out really soon that I think you'll find really interesting. Until next time, live long, prosper, be one with the Force, and I will catch you guys all later.